And we are live. Hello and welcome again to the Yeg Show with T. Today I'm pleased to introduce University of Alberta's Professor Tope Oriola. And here is my introduction. Calls for changes to policing in Edmonton fell on deaf ears, according to Professor Oriola. He joins us now to talk about policing, Black Lives Matter, and police brutality. Good morning, Professor. Thanks for taking the time.
Good morning, Madam Tudu, and thanks for having me.
I'm just a little girl. I don't know about this, madam. So why do you feel that council's motion following presentations at the public hearing is disappointing? You've written passionately about this in the last couple of days.
Well, there are moments in the life of a society, and specifically a political system, that require concise, succinct, and conscientious bravery, devoid of petty politics, and require political leaders to rise beyond the self and political calculus. I believe that the Edmonton City Council and the mayor in particular did not rise to the occasion. I imagine they must have their own reasons. I do not mean to discountenance those, but I find it mind-boggling as a policing scholar, as a criminologist who has studied issues relating to policing and use of force and weaponization of police, that they have decided to take the easiest route, to take the most tepid response, which is to kick the can down the road, to set up a citizen panel. And experience would suggest that oftentimes when governments do not wish to respond decisively on an issue, they set up some sort of commission, some sort of inquiry, and I think this is what they have done. Now, and to look at things quite broadly, there are certain steps that the mayor, acting in the capacity and the authority of his office, can do on his own regarding policing. There are also things that he needs or can do within council, as a member of council himself, and of course with the supporter, the other councillors in constituting the Edmonton City Council. This could, for instance, include putting an end to carding being done by the Edmonton Police Service. And of course, issuing a policy regarding recruitment, regarding discipline and so forth. Basic human resource management matters within the EPS. We'll let the records show that they have refused to do that. And the approach they have taken is one that attempts to shun responsibility and just buy time, basically, and which would then ensure that we will continue to talk about this several months from now, rather than utilizing the moment to make life altering changes.
I see what you're saying, but would you say that this is still a question of representation at the City of Edmonton Council, that there are not enough Black people there to explain? And I know about 150 people gave their presentations to the city, but I'm thinking, is this still a question of a lack of representation?
Well, yes and no. Yes, because they do lack any form of serious representation of minorities. It is not a very diverse body. But the fact that is neither here nor there. These are elective positions. Nothing stops a Black or brown candidate from running for mayor or city council or city councillorship and so on. So there is limited diversity at city council, which research shows tends to play a role in terms of what is considered important to be discussed, and what kinds of decisions are made, even the tenor and texture of conversations on bodies such as the council, boards of corporations, and whether public or privately owned, and so forth. When you don't have certain representation on the basis of gender, ethno-racial diversity, and sexuality, and so on, certain kinds of decisions get taken that may not be representative of the conscience collective of the people. So that's obviously something to be considered. But second, and here's the other part of the argument, and that is that a lot had gone on prior to their passing that motion, which is in fact it's a constellation of matters fused into one, that had made it very clear and incontrovertible that things needed to change. And so none of them needed to be a black or brown person to recognize the urgency of the moment and the imperative of concise steps to address policing issues in a city. They chose not to act the way they should. A black or brown person need not be in the room for people to recognize the salience of excessive use of force within the city of Edmonton, and issues relating to carding and poor police minority relations and so forth. All of those things were very well known long before the assassination of George Floyd, long before that 15,000 people rally in June. All of those things were already in place. We knew these things were going on. Council members were aware of it. The mayor was aware of it. They simply chose what was politically expedient for them. Just again, kicking the can down the road.
Well, that's very disappointing. I'm just wondering whether it's part of your portfolio to request a meeting with the mayor himself to hear all this that you're saying and see maybe that would change anything. Do you think that would change anything?
Well, I don't know that would change anything. The mayor presided over council on the day that I gave my presentation to council remotely, just as we're doing now. And my sense of it was that the message was effectively conveyed. It seemed to have fallen on attentive ears, in all fairness, on that day. Of course, what you do with what you hear, what you were attentive to, is a different subject matter. Whether or not you act on what's been presented or what you've been informed about is a different subject matter. But I like your suggestion, and I have to admit it's one that I never considered until this moment. So that may be a line of action that I would consider in the days and weeks to come. So thank you for suggesting that.
You're welcome. The Anti-Racism Committee was one of the first committees to be laid off during the pandemic. And do you maybe see the same thing happening to this safety, it's called the Safety and Wellbeing Task Force that Edmonton Council is bringing together to prevaricate to hold off on dealing with this issue? Do you see the same thing happening to this task force as it happened to the Anti-Racism Committee?
There's a real possibility, in part because governments come and go, personalities change, and priorities, even of specific governments, also change. So that within the life of a single governmental administration, their priorities, go up, some go down. There are exogenous and endogenous factors that play a crucial role in what becomes prioritized and what is relegated to the background. And the Anti-Racism Committee that you mentioned is a fine example of that. It was once, at least discursively, at least in terms of public conversation, a priority somehow. If it was no longer a priority and suffered, a demise because, again, it was no longer a priority. And this is within the same government, within the same administration. So I worry that the idea of a citizens panel for well-being and so forth is cosmetic.
Right.
It does not address the underlying structural variables. We do not need a citizens panel to say to EPS, stop brutalizing civilians. Seven police officers should not gather on a single individual who has no arms or ammunition, and all the cops are fully armed to the teeth. We do not need a citizens panel to say to the EPS, you need to discipline errant police officers, people who take an insouciant attitude, a lackadaisical attitude to the lives and well-being of our fellow citizens. Now, you don't need a citizens panel for that. And as I said to the council several days back, if the mayor or a city councilor were recorded in a cell phone video slapping one of their constituents, none of them would be able to keep their seat.
No.
So why then do we tolerate police officers, oftentimes multiple officers, who gather on citizens every now and then and apply excessive force? Why do they get away with that? It is a basic HR matter, and it has to be viewed that way. We don't allow our teachers, for instance, to have a long record of multiple physical or sexual abuses against children before we kick them out, before they lose their license. So why do we allow, officers to just keep piling up disciplinary issues on their file and somehow think that because they are officers, that somehow it's so fundamental to society that we cannot push them out? And it is a disservice, and this is important to balance the debate. It is a disservice to the officers who are doing a fine job under very difficult circumstances on a daily basis. Keeping errant, indisciplined people in police service is not fair to police officers who are doing an honest and respectable job every day of the week. We owe it to them as much as we owe it to the average Edmontonian, to the average citizen, to ensure that such policing misfits do not remain in service. Kick out chronic human rights abusers. They tend to be individuals with serious psychopathology. You cannot cure them. They're not curable. These are individuals whose psychopathology often begins in childhood. You're not going to cure them in their 30s or 40s. The best bet is do not hire such people in the first place. And if you do somehow hire them, ensure that there are proper disciplinary mechanisms in place to weed the police service of such, because the honest and respectable service of law-abiding police officers depends on our acting decisively on such issues.
Now, thanks for taking the time to elaborate on that. What is wrong with the EPS? Would they admit they have systemic issues regarding recruitment?
So I think that in fairness, they have made a level of progress in terms of admitting that there are certain issues that they need to address. And that has to be acknowledged. I'm sorry?
Let me add this. You wrote, I'm talking about, this is from your write-up, and you said that the EPS needs to make sure there's a minimum entry requirement. They need to employ more women. So could you please focus on this as you
absolutely.
What's wrong with EPS?
Absolutely. So there's been a level of acknowledgement along those lines, but there's also a level of reluctance to make a definitive commitment to hiring university graduates only.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's a little nuance in there. The minimum entry qualification is still grade 12.
Right.
But in the last few years, they have shown an increasing willingness and capacity to hire university graduates, including some people with masters. And I hear a couple maybe with PhDs. I have not confirmed that, but I've heard anecdotally that they've done that, which is good. But what we are calling for, what I am calling for, is a university graduate only police service.
All right.
University graduate degree holders who are recruited into policing across multiple jurisdictions in North America tend to understand the subtleties and vagaries of the human condition. They approach citizens and potential suspects with empathy. Oftentimes, they call for mental health support rather than making arrests. They engage in de-escalation techniques. They have superior verbal skills. These are not personal opinions. This is what research shows. And therefore, in terms of the outcomes for our citizens, in terms of the appropriate response, the necessary disciplinary response and utilization of training, university graduate officers make better judgment calls than those without university degrees. And I haven't said that. The ranks of killer cops, and I've said this on multiple platforms, the ranks of killer cops are populated by police officers without university degrees.
Right.
Almost on felony in several police jurisdictions across North America, it often tends to be 100% of killer cops, i.e. police officers who have snuffed life out of citizens, oftentimes in relatively benign and totally negligible circumstances. So for instance, the penalty for having a broken tail light is not death.
No.
So people should not die. A citizen should not die because they had a broken tail light, or because they were jaywalking, or because their license plate is expired. It makes no sense. What exactly is the crime, and what is the response? There has to be proportionality, and this is what we're saying. So it starts from what the officers bring to the table. But when someone is fresh out of high school, and within a year or two, with limited, maybe some part-time, jobs here and there, and then gets into police service, we are setting up such individuals. And again, 21st century policing, we're setting up such individuals for failure, because they may not have the necessary repertoire in their arsenal, the empathy, the education, the learning, the basic understanding of the dynamics of today's social life to engage as citizens. You can have a 30, 35-year stellar career in the police service without drawing your gun from its hustler. It is perfectly possible. Police in the United Kingdom do not routinely carry guns. No. And they still do their jobs. So that's what we're saying. So that we need to raise the standard, raise the minimum entry requirement, make it a bachelor's degree in nursing, social work, psychology, political science, law, and all of those things. We need such people in service. And you mentioned the gender aspect. Most killer cops, and in many police jurisdictions, a solid 100% are men. And the research is very robust. The research is very clear. Female police officers, again, they de-escalate more. They engage in verbal interactions with suspects and are less likely to use force. And therefore, they're less likely to resort to excessive use of force. And the police departments with quote unquote reasonable number of women tend to do a better job in terms of outcomes for citizens, and they have lower rates of use of force and so on and so forth. What that tells us is that, and I've proposed a minimum threshold of 40%. That has to be the minimum. That 4 out of 10 police officers have got to be women. even though our broader goal, the ideal situation, has to be 5 out of 10, 50-50. So again, this is crucial because of what the research shows. Again, across multiple jurisdictions, women do not resort to using excessive force. Women engage in better verbal interactions with suspects. And so when you pair up police officers on perhaps the basis of gender and all that, and I recognize that gender identities are relatively fluid and so forth, but it's still, that has its place in today's policing environment. There's a whole lot of research around the way that suspects respond to police officers who are females versus the way they respond to police officers who are males. That's a whole different subject matter. But it is incumbent on us, given the available robust evidence, to recruit more women into the police service.
Thank you, sir. I was just wondering, have you ever tried to consult for the EPS?
To consult for the EPS?
Yeah, have they heard all this? You know, it sounds really good, but I mean, do they know what you're talking about?
Well, I recall that I got an email from a gentleman from the EPS when one of our publications came out in 2012, but I never heard anything on that afterwards. And quite frankly, I'm contented with just doing my job and disseminating rather the findings out there. But no, I have never consulted for them, but I have endeavored to make findings of my research and my distillation of the findings of other colleagues across North America available by, going to council, appearing before the Edmonton Public School Board regarding the School Resource Officer Program, writing articles that are for general consumption rather than 8,000 or 10,000 word essays that we're used to in academia. So we're doing our part in that. But keep in mind, we have no control over what policymakers or the EPS hierarchy then decide to do. And quite frankly, that's their prerogative, not mine. But we've been doing our part to make sure that as responsible citizens, we're making findings of research, a chunk of which is funded by the government. So, by the way, the studies are funded by the government through various funding agencies. So we've tried to do our part as responsible citizens to make the findings of these studies widely available.
So I'm just wondering if there's a disconnect. They appear to be on a charm offensive with everyone. That's the EPS. But it appears again they may have attentive ears, but are they really listening or hearing or reading this research about employing graduates, employing 4 out of 10 women, or employing 50, making their workforce 50-50 on the gender basis? I just wonder how much of that is in their policies. So I'd have to ask, the police myself that.
At the policy level, no, there's no evidence to suggest that. When I was on the panel before the Edmonton City Council in June, there was a gentleman from the EPS who was part of that panel, a relatively senior officer, who also happens to be a PhD student, I believe, somewhere in Europe. And so had an understanding of the broad issues. And there was also another officer, probably slightly more junior than the other person, who appeared alongside his spouse on that panel. So we had 2 police officers, EPS officers, one of whom had been in service for 22 years by his own admission, and the spouse of one of them on the panel. So I believe that if they had not heard of any of these findings prior to that panel presentation, they can no longer claim that they do not know or some of what we've been putting out vis-a-vis findings from socio-scientific research on how to go about this major reform. So again, what they do with those findings is entirely their prerogative.
we had been focusing on the EPS, and I want to move to the issue of systemic discrimination. And I'm quite aware that a professor at the University of Alberta, most academicians live in a bubble. You may or may not experience systemic racism. You may or may not understand what it means when you are denied or deprived of something because of the color of your skin. Because my understanding is in academia, all that matters is your intellectual prowess and how well you're able to type out your thoughts and things like that. So please correct me if I'm wrong. How then can we end systemic discrimination broadly in our society? Is there a way out? What are your thoughts?
Right. So for first, let me both agree and disagree with your remarks. So
You
yes,
don't live in a bubble, no?
academia is a bubble. It's what I'd like to call a private cocoon.
Right.
You're cocooned from some, not all, maybe even many of the vagaries that we've talked about. But that is not the same as immunity. Some of those issues are evident even in academia. Again, because academia is not a focus, I will spare you and the viewers details of that. But just to say that systemic racism does exist in academia. Anyone who says so or who says otherwise is delusional. There is systemic racism. We see that in several bureaucratic processes. We see that in the hiring processes. We see that in some of the issuance of some of the most prestigious awards and so on and so forth. These issues are real. They are incontrovertible, absolutely. But that's a whole different texture. That's more middle class concern. It's not a life and death matter. The type we've been talking about, whether or not somebody survives or is allowed to breed on the streets or gets a job to be able to feed themselves or their families. So those are not the kinds of things we deal with in academia. So we are relatively privileged people, and we understand that. We recognize that, and we try to shut up when some of the serious issues have been brought out by members of the public. Now, with respect to systemic racism, broadly speaking, I think that the battle is won and lost fairly early in life. It begins from the family environment and the early socialization influences surrounding people's lives. What cartoons do children watch, for instance? I have heard from colleagues who study various media formats. I am not a media scholar myself, but I have colleagues who study films and study what children watch, cartoons and programs and various information dissemination formats targeted at children. I understand that some of those cartoons are explicitly racist. I'm not saying all of them, but I've heard from white parents who happen to be colleagues who said they were alarmed at at the contents of some of the cartoons their kids were watching, and therefore they stopped just buying DVDs and handing them, in those days of DVDs, handing them over to the kids without sitting down first of all to see what the contents look like. So we have work to do. Also, of course, the education system. What are we explicitly and implicitly teaching people regarding minorities, the portrayal of indigenous peoples in textbooks, the portrayal of Black people in documentaries, in textbooks? What kind of history do we teach? Who are the heroes of those histories? Who are the villains of those histories? So all of these things matter because they send very powerful but subliminal messages to people. They say a lot even when they're not saying much. And therefore, the curriculum is fundamental. The various media formats, the films, the cartoons, and so on, all of these things are important. So education policy is key. And of course, that also extends to the university level, what is being taught. Until very recently, when a powerful movement began, a movement for quote and unquote decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing higher education. Most of the thoughts, most of the philosophies, most of the textbooks being used and writings, other writings being used were those by white male authors with very little space for female writers as a whole and minority writers, so black and brown scholars and so forth. People just sort of overwhelmingly focused on white scholars and white male scholars. Also, that had always been an historical pattern. That was always the way things were done. In other words, if you were female, if you were black or brown, you needed to clearly and consistently articulate how and why you are a creator and disseminator of knowledge. Your white male colleague didn't need to do that. But thankfully, those issues are now being taken up and very seriously too. Now, there are certain things, and I like to, hopefully make this abundantly clear. There are certain aspects of what we're talking about that are not easy to legislate. Basic microaggressions and so on. Somebody called me this, and those are sometimes, because this is the state of law is on the side of such errant members of the public. But there are others that can be legislated by way of government policies and laws. And so the workplace, beginning with the government bureaucracy, and then, of course, laws regarding assault and prosecution of offenders, and so on and so forth. These are things that are within the powers of operators of the system. Now, it's incumbent on the government to have policies that clearly spell out the need for equity, the need for diversity, the need for inclusion. A lot of organizations now have that. But what do those policies mean? And how are they being implemented? There are still organizations as we speak where, despite putting in place mechanisms for reporting abuse and so on, or discrimination, the staff or any staff who reports such incidents actually gets punished, not directly, but indirectly. That oftentimes could be the end of their careers. The moment they express, or a complaint or file a complaint, that could be the end of their careers. And so people would rather not see anything. So as long as we're fostering such environments that make it impossible for people to report abuse, then we're fostering systemic racism. And I'd like to speak to how the South African government under the late Madiba, Nelson Mandela, went about improving inclusion, diversity, and under the Black Economic Empowerment Strategy in South Africa. Basically, they required companies to have a certain percentage, and I don't remember the exact numbers, of members of their boards and staff to be a certain percentage Black. Now, keep in mind, this was a country coming from decades of apartheid, which it's, of course, very similar to what we're talking about here. Not identical, but similar, because it worked on the basis of discrimination, and that discrimination was distilled to one basic factor: skin color. And so that improved the lives of many millions, in fact, of South Africans within a relatively short time. So we know that an anti-systemic racism policy can work because it has worked. We have seen it work elsewhere. Now, the story is not all doom and gloom. In Canada, there are significant successes that have been recorded, but more needs to be done. It's particularly in terms of labor market outcomes. We know, for instance, that so-called visible minorities, so Black and brown people, Middle Eastern people, Asian people, people of African descent, and so forth, are more likely to have university degrees. But they are less likely to be gainfully employed. And even when gainfully employed, they are paid lower wages than their white counterparts with the same experience or with the same qualifications. Those are manifestations of systemic racism. But let's face it, a number of people, in some cases, a handful of people are there making those decisions. From the HR level to the hiring director or chair or dean, or what, they are the ones making these decisions. And we've got to say to ourselves, what kinds of decisions are we making? Who gets offered $65,000 salary for a position, and who gets offered 75,000 for the same position at roughly the same period? Those are decisions that a couple of individuals are making. So when yes, it is systemic to the extent that it is self-perpetuating. There may be no single individual responsible and so forth, but individuals are not innocent in this. Right. The people making these decisions are not ignorant of what you're doing. When you offer somebody a starting salary of 65K, so that hoping that, well, they may take it or what could ask for more, then by the time you give them an extra 4,000 or 5,000, they are happy with themselves. They think they have gotten a good deal, but you started somebody else off with 75K, who then bumps it up to 80 or 85. You've set both of them on completely different trajectories. The one with the lower salary is never going to make as much money as the person with the higher salary in their entire career course. That's the reality of it. And this breeds transgenerational wealth disparity, because you are setting one up for maybe not total failure, but definitely a life of inequality, because they are not making as much money as they should for doing the same job as their colleagues. So these are ways that these issues are happening. So part of efforts to promote inclusion and ensure fairness and put an end to systemic racism is having a very transparent policy where salaries are published, where offers are firm, where we know we're hiring somebody with a bachelor's degree, minimum 2 years of education, or 2 years of experience. X amount is what we're offering, and that is publicly available knowledge. All of these secrecies, these backroom deals and ad hoc arrangements are fostering systemic racism, because they give room for chronic color-based monochromatic discrimination. All right. So that people can favor those they like and punish those whose races they don't like or are totally indifferent to, because indifference is just as brutal as this whole idea of discrimination in and of itself. Not caring about the outcome, not caring whether somebody lives or dies is one of the major issues we're talking about here.
Professor, I was around over the Canada Day holidays, and one of my reflections is how patriotic Canadians are, as in even my daughter knows the Canadian anthem, and my sister sings it, our family, they sing it with a lot of. And that is new for me, because 17 years in England, I didn't get all that emotion. And the more I spend in this country, I get how patriotic Canadians are to their country. So my question, therefore, is, given the level, and I've spoken to different people who said, oh, Canada helped me do this, pay for my healthcare, gave me this, hence the loyalty, hence the love. So should we now therefore complain that a country that we have gotten so much from errs or falls short in ABC? And so I'm just wondering, if Canada, if we're this patriotic, we've also, you guys are also benefiting from the same system. Why complain?
That's a very good point. One that I am totally and heartily welcome. Now, nation states construe themselves in certain ways. They represent themselves to their own citizens and to their peers countries have peers
Yeah.
in very specific ways. And of course, to the broader global community as well. So, for instance, when a citizen of Saudi Arabia or a citizen of Libya or a citizen of Iran migrates to Canada, and maybe a few years later, after becoming a Canadian citizen, or while in the process of becoming a Canadian citizen, begins to maybe file a lawsuit or addresses a press conference and says, look, my rights have been trampled upon. In that moment, they are not speaking as a citizen of Saudi Arabia. They are not speaking as a citizen or someone whose home country is Libya. They speak as people resident in Canada, saying to Canada and the Canadian state that you told me you were better than this.
Right. Okay.
So you're holding Canada, we are holding the Canadian state to its own self-professed standard as a liberal, democratic, free, and open society. So as someone whose home country is Nigeria, for instance, Nigeria is not the bastion of respect for human rights. I know that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's not the issue. This is a completely different context. This is a country that has proven itself to be a pioneer in many ways, to be one that more often than not respects rights. Do we have issues? Absolutely. But there's also, you have to admit, no matter how critical you are of the Canadian state or society, that this is, for all intents and purposes, a society that is, broadly speaking, moving in the right direction on many, many fronts. We have their major issues remain, but you cannot deny that reality. So what we're saying is, it is an endogenous standard. It is not an exogenous standard. It is a standard, and it is a discourse that is born out of the narrative that the Canadian state has presented and construed about itself as a free, open, liberal, democratic society. And therefore, we owe the Canadian state to its own standard rather than some other person's standard. And so there is no contradiction whatsoever in saying that, oh, well, I am benefiting from XYZ. I absolutely love this about this. I have been in Canada now for almost 15 years.
Yeah.
I'm a relatively new Canadian, obviously, by any standard, but I do know that we have some work to do in certain areas. And so we've got to create that balance between the accomplishments that have been made and the issues that remain. There is no contradiction in speaking about both at one and the same time.
Thanks for making that clear. Before you go, Professor, what books are you reading now? What role? 2 questions in one here. What role does fate play with all the research? Does fate count? Does it matter?
Good point. Let me start with the book one, because that's an easier question.
Not anything too academic, mind it. I'll go to bed in the night. Just something.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have 2 books. As I've been going through Hillary Clinton's book, What Happened.
Oh God, I don't like that book.
No, I haven't finished it. It's taking me.
I didn't finish it.
You know,
no, my sister loves it. I can't stand it.
I see. Yeah. So they're, chronicling how she lost the elections, or how in the circumstances and so on and so forth. Gripping and on many pages and in many ways. I think that what a difference it would make, right now in the world if she were president. So again, that, but also Michelle Obama's book.
Becoming.
That's probably the most recent one that I picked up, and I've been reading about her early life and aunt and uncle whose home her family rented when she was growing up at a certain stage in her formative years and so on. So it's amazing just looking at the stories of these 2 eminent and powerful women and their rise from well, different backgrounds, obviously, into the stratosphere that they occupied and continue to occupy in the global imaginary. I applaud both of them for putting their thoughts on paper and for posterity. With respect to faith, I think faith is, very crucial, very fundamental. I was raised a Christian. I had the opportunity to say to somebody not too long ago, well, I am not a Christian convert. I was born a Christian, so I would respect. I think growing up in a Christian home, the values and the norms and the do's and don'ts do not leave you, at least not entirely. They shape in many ways your worldview. That of course gets it gets modified, hopefully gets refined, and maybe even becomes much more broad and all encompassing and so on and so forth. But you never fully lose that, even if you don't go to church regularly and all of that. So for me, my faith is central to who I am. It is central to what I've become and what I hope I am becoming. To borrow Michelle Obama's language, faith is crucial. It's helped me at moments of personal crises or situations. Believe me, university professors also have difficult periods in their lives. So I see you don't agree, but I know that's an argument I want to win, so I won't go too deep into that. Faith helped, when I lost my mother in December of 2018. Thank you for that. My faith saw me through that very, very difficult period. I was particularly close to my mother, and so that was hard. That was hard.
You never really get over the demise of a parent.
Probably not. And I'm learning that daily.
It gets over time. But you
don't fully. I don't think anyone ever fully recovers from it. I think we learn to cope with it. I think we learn to live fully and well. That tragedy. But I think a part of you, holds on to that, the memories, not just the childhood, but even just the guidance, the words, that phone call, that video chat in specific moments. You miss that. Certain things, certain situations remind you of them. And because I am now an orphan, I lost my father long before then. And by the way, I am currently looking for wealthy adoptive parents. So
you're an established University of Alberta professor who is also an orphan. I like.
So, but jokes apart, jokes apart. The memories remain, and time heals. Thankfully, time heals. And in such moments, in those cloudy days, the faith.
That's where your faith kicks in.
And the faith makes you overcome.
Oh, yeah.
Those situations. Yeah.
Oh, Professor Oriola, I want to say thank you so much for your time. This was an extended interview. It's always nice talking to you. You have a grasp of Edmonton, of what you do. You are a professor of sociology and a criminologist at the University of Alberta. It is always nice talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your fine anchoring and for your professionalism. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. Okay. Bye-bye.